Chapter 14. That to acquire knowledge of God one must use the way of remotion. Accordingly, having proved that there is a first being which we call God, we must inquire into his nature. Now, in treating of the divine essence, the principal method to be followed is that of remotion, for the divine essence by its immensity surpasses every form to which our intellect reaches, and thus we cannot apprehend it by knowing what it is. But we have some knowledge of it by knowing what it is not, and we come closer to the knowledge of it insofar as we can remove a greater number of things from it by our intellect. For the more completely we see how a thing differs from others, the more perfectly we know it, since each thing has in itself its own being distinct from all other things. Thus, when we know the definition of a thing, first we place it in a genus by which we know in general what it is, and afterwards we add differences to mark its distinction from other things, and thus we arrive at the complete knowledge of a thing's essence. Since, however, we are unable in treating of the divine essence to take what as a genus, nor can we express its distinction from other things by affirmative differences, we must express it by negative differences. Now, just as in affirmative differences one restricts another and brings us the nearer to a complete description of the thing according as it makes it differ from more things, so one negative difference is restricted by another that marks a distinction from more things. Thus, if we say that God is not an accident, we thereby distinguish him from all accidents. Then if we add that he is not a body, we shall distinguish him also from certain substances, and thus in gradation he will be differentiated by such like negations from all beside himself. And then, when he is known as distinct from all things, we shall arrive at a proper consideration of him. It will not, however, be perfect, because we shall not know what he is in himself. Therefore, in order to proceed by way of remotion about the knowledge of God, let us take up as principle that which is already made manifest by what we have said above, chapter 13, namely that God is altogether unchangeable. This is also confirmed by the authority of sacred scripture, for it is said, I am God, and I do not change, Malachi 3:6, and whom there is no change, James 1:17, and God is not as a man that he should be changed, Numbers 23:19. The divine nature, chapter 15, that God is eternal. From the foregoing, it is also clear that God is eternal, for whatever begins or ceases to be, suffers this through movement or change. Now it has been shown, chapter 13, that God is altogether unchangeable, therefore he is eternal, having neither beginning nor end. Again, only things which are moved are measured by time, because time is the measure of movement, as is clear in physics. Now God is absolutely without movement, as we have already proved, chapter 13. Therefore we cannot mark before and after in him. Therefore in him there is not being after non-being, nor can he have non-being after being, nor is it possible to find any cessation in his being, because these things cannot be understood apart from time. Therefore he is without beginning and end, and has all his being simultaneously, and in this consists the notion of eternity. Moreover, if at any time he was not, afterwards he was not, and afterwards was, he was brought by some out of non-being into being, not by himself, because what is not cannot do anything, and if by another, this other is prior to him. Now it has been shown, chapter 13, that God is the first cause, therefore he did not begin to be, therefore neither will he cease to be, because that which always was has the power to always be, therefore he is eternal. Furthermore, we observe that in the world there are certain things which can be and not be, namely those that are subject to generation and corruption. Now all that can possibly be has a cause, for since in itself it is equally related to two things, namely being and not being, it follows that if it acquires being, this is the result of some cause, but as proved above, chapter 13, by Aristotle's argument, we cannot go on to infinity in causes, therefore we must suppose something with necessary existence. Now, every necessary thing either has a cause of its necessity from without, or has no such cause, but is necessary of itself. But we cannot go on to infinity in necessary things that have causes of their necessity from without. Therefore we must suppose some first necessary thing which is necessary of itself, and this is God, since he is the first cause, as proved above, chapter 13. Therefore God is eternal, since whatever is necessary of itself is eternal. Again, Aristotle proves the everlastingness of movement from the everlastingness of time, and from this he goes on to prove the everlastingness of the substance that is the cause of movement. Now the first moving substance is God, therefore he is everlasting, and supposing the everlastingness of time and movement to be denied, there still remains the argument and proof of the everlastingness of substance. For if movement had a beginning, it must have had its beginning from some mover, and if this mover had a beginning, it had its beginning from some agent. And thus either we shall go on to infinity, or we shall come to something without a beginning. Divine authority bears witness to this truth. Thus the psalm reads, "But you, O Lord, endure forever," Psalm 101:13, and again, "But you are always the self-same, and your years shall not fail," Psalm 101:28. Chapter 16, that in God there is no passive potency. Now, if God is eternal, it follows of necessity that he is not in potency, for everything in whose substance there is an admixture of potency is possibly non-existent as regards whatever it has of potency. For that which may possibly be may possibly not be. Now God in himself cannot not be, since he is eternal. Therefore in God there is no potency to be. Again, although that which is sometimes potential and sometimes actual is in point of time potential before being actual, nevertheless act is simply before potency, because potency does not bring itself into act, but needs to be brought into act by something actual. Therefore, whatever is in any way potential has something previous to it. Now God is the first being and the first cause, as stated above, chapter 13. Therefore in him there is no admixture of potency. Again, that which of itself must necessarily exist can in no way have possible existence, since whatever of itself must necessarily exist has no cause, whereas whatever has possible existence has a cause, as proved above, chapter 15. Now God in himself must necessarily exist. Therefore he can in no way have possible existence, therefore no potency is to be found in his essence. Again, everything acts according as it is actual, therefore that which is not wholly actual acts not by its whole self, but by part of itself. Now that which does not act by its whole self is not the first agent, since it acts by participation of something and not by its essence. Therefore the first agent, which is God, has no admixture of potency, but is pure act. Moreover, just as a thing is naturally apt to act insofar as it is actual, so it is natural for it to be passive insofar as it is in potency, for movement is the act of that which is in potency. Now God is altogether impassible and immovable, as stated above, chapter 13. Therefore in him there is no potency, namely that which is passive. Further, we notice in the world something that passes from potency to act. Now it does not reduce itself from potency to act, because that which is potential is not yet, hence neither can it act. Therefore it must be preceded by something else, by which it can be brought from potency to act, and if this again passes from potency to act, it must be preceded by something else, by which it can be brought from potency to act. But we cannot go on thus to infinity, therefore we must come to something that is wholly actual and in no way potential, and this we call God. Chapter 17, that in God there is no matter. From this it follows that God is not matter. For matter such as it is in potency. Again, matter is not a principle of activity, hence, as the philosopher puts it, efficient and material causes do not coincide. Now, as stated above, chapter 13, it belongs to God to be the first efficient cause of things, therefore he is not matter. And moreover, for those who referred all things to matter as their first cause, it followed that natural things exist by chance, and against these it is argued in physics. Therefore, if God, who is the first cause, is the material cause of things, it follows that all things exist by chance. Further, matter does not become the cause of an actual thing except by being altered and changed. Therefore, if God is immovable, as proved above, chapter 13, he can in no way be a cause of things as their matter. The Catholic faith professes this truth, asserting that God created all things not out of his substance, but out of nothing. The ravings of David of Dinant are confounded by this, who dared to assert that God is the same as prime matter, because if they were not the same, they would need to differ by certain differences, and thus they would not be simple, such since in that which differs from another thing by a difference, the very difference argues composition. Now this proceeds from his ignorance of the distinction between difference and diversity. For a thing is said to be different in relation to something, as is said in metaphysics, because whatever is different differs by something, whereas things are said to be diverse so absolutely from the fact that they are not the same thing. Accordingly, we must seek for a difference in things which have something in common, for we have to point to something in them whereby they differ. Thus, two species have a common genus from which they must be distinguished by differences. But in those things which have nothing in common, we do not have to look for their differences, for they are diverse by themselves. For thus are opposite differences distinguished from one another, because they do not participate in a genus as a part of their essence. Consequently, we must not ask in what they differ, for they are diversified by their very selves. Thus too God and prime matter are distinguished, since they have nothing in common, the one being pure act and the other being pure potency. Chapter 18, that in God there is no composition. From the foregoing, we are able to conclude that there is no composition in God, for in every composite thing there must be act and potency, since several things cannot become one simply unless there be something actual there and something else potential. For those things that are in act are not united except as an assemblage of or group, which are not one simply. Also in these, the very parts that are gathered together are as a potency with respect to the union, for they are actually unified after being potentially unitable. But in God there is no potency, chapter 16, therefore in him there is no composition. Again, every composite comes after its components, therefore the first being, which is God, chapter 14, has no component parts. Further, every composite is potentially dissoluble so far as its composite nature is concerned, although in some there is something else incompatible with dissolution. Now that which is dissoluble is in potency to non-being. But this cannot be said of God, since he necessarily exists by his very essence, therefore there is no composition in him. Moreover, every composition requires a compounder, for if there is composition, it results from several things, and things that are several in themselves would not combine together unless they were united by a compounder. If then God were composite, he would have a compounder, for he would not compound himself, since no thing is its own cause, for it would precede itself, which is impossible. Now the compounder is the efficient cause of the composite, therefore God would have an efficient cause, and thus he would not be the first cause, which was proved above, chapter 13. Again, in any genus, the more simple a thing is, the more excellent it is. For example, in the genus of hot things is fire, which has no admixture of cold. Therefore, whatever is the most noble of all things must be the height of simplicity. Now that which obtains the summit of nobility in things is what we call God, since he is the first cause, because the cause is more excellent than its effect. Therefore, there can be no composition in him. Furthermore, in every composite thing, the good does not belong to this or that part, but to the whole, and I speak of good in reference to that goodness which is proper to, and to the perfection of, the whole. Thus the parts are imperfect in relation to the whole. For example, the parts of a man are not a man, nor do the parts of the number 6 have the perfection of 6. Nor do the parts of a line come to the perfection of the measure found in the whole line. Therefore, if God is composite, his proper perfection and goodness are found in the whole of God, but not in any of his parts. And thus the good that is proper to him will not be purely in him, and consequently he will not be the first and supreme good. Further, before every multitude it is necessary to find unity. Now in every composite there is multitude, therefore that which is before all things, namely God, must be devoid of all composition. Chapter 13, that in God there is nothing violent or beside nature. Hence the philosopher concludes that in God there cannot be anything violent or outside nature. For whatever has in itself anything violent or beside nature has something added to itself, since that which belongs to a thing's essence cannot be violent or beside nature. Now no simple thing has in itself anything that is added, for this would mean it is composite. Since then God is simple, as shown above, chapter 18, there can be nothing in him that is violent or besides nature. Further, the necessity of compulsion is a necessity imposed by another, but in God there is no necessity imposed by another, for he is necessary of himself, and the cause of necessity in other things. Chapter 15, therefore nothing is compulsory in him. Moreover, wherever there is violence, there can be something other than what belongs to a thing by its very nature, since violence is contrary to that which is according to nature, but it is not possible for anything to be in God that does not belong to him according to his nature, since by his very nature he is necessary being, as shown above, chapter 15. Therefore there can be nothing violent in him. Again, everything that is compelled or unnatural is naturally apt to be moved by another, because that which is done by compulsion has an external principle without any concurrence on the part of the patient. Now God is altogether immovable, as shown above, chapter 13, therefore nothing in him can be violent or unnatural. Chapter 20, that God is not a body. From the foregoing, we are also able to prove that God is not a body, for since every body is a continuous substance, it is composite and has parts. Now God is not composite, as we have shown, chapter 18, therefore he is not a body. Further, every quantitative substance is somehow in potency, for that which is continuous is potentially divisible to infinity, and number can be infinitely augmented. Now every body is a quantitative substance, therefore every body is in potency, but God is not in potency, but is pure act, as shown above, chapter 16, therefore God is not a body. Again, if God were a body, he would have to be a physical body, for a mathematical body does not exist by itself, as the philosopher proves, since dimensions are accidents. Now he is not a physical body, for he is immovable, as we have proved, chapter 13, and every physical body is movable, therefore God is not a body. Wherever every body is finite, which is proved in regard to both the spherical and to rectilinear bodies. Now we are able by our intellect and imagination, rectilinear bodies in coli et mundi. Now we are able by our intellect and imagination to soar above any finite body. Therefore, if God were a body, our intellect and imagination would be able to think of something greater than God, and thus God would not exceed our intellect, which is inadmissible. Therefore, he is not a body. Further, intellective knowledge is more certain than sensitive. Now, among natural things, we find some that are objects of sense. Therefore, there are also some that are objects of intellect, but the order of powers is according to the order of objects in the same way as their distinction. Therefore, above all sensible objects, there is an intelligible object existing in natural things, but every body that exists among things is sensible. Therefore, above all bodies, it is possible to find something more excellent. Therefore, if God were a body, he would not be the first and supreme being. Again, a living thing is more excellent than any body devoid of life. Now, the life of a living body is more excellent than that body, since by it excels all other bodies. Therefore, that which is excelled by nothing is not a body, but such as God. Therefore, he is not a body. Moreover, we find the philosophers proving the same conclusion by arguments based on the eternity of movement as follows. In an everlasting movement, the first mover must not be moved, neither essentially nor accidentally, as we have proved above, chapter 13. Now the body of the heavens is moved in the circle with an everlasting movement. Therefore, its first mover is not moved either essentially or accidentally. Now no body causes local movement unless it itself be moved, because moved and mover must be simultaneous, and thus the body that causes movement must be itself moved, so it can be simultaneous with the body that is moved. Moreover, no power in a body causes movement unless it is moved accidentally, since when the body is moved, the power of that body is moved accidentally. Therefore, the first mover of the heavens is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. Now God is that to which the movement of the heavens is ultimately reduced as to the first immovable mover. Therefore, God is not a body. Again, no infinite power is a power residing in a magnitude, but the power of the first mover is possesses an infinite power, therefore it does not reside in a magnitude, and thus God, who is the first mover, is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. The first proposition is proved as follows. If a power residing in a magnitude be infinite, this magnitude is either finite or infinite. But there is no infinite magnitude as proved in physics and coli et mundi. And it is not possible for a finite magnitude to have an infinite power, therefore in no magnitude can there be an infinite power. That there cannot be an infinite power in an infinite magnitude is proved thus. A great power produces in less time the same effect which a lesser power produces in more time, whatever kind this effect may be, whether of alteration of local movement or of any other kind of movement. Now an infinite power surpasses every finite power. It follows, therefore, that it produces its effect more rapidly by causing a more rapid movement than any finite power. Nor can this greater rapidity be one of time. Therefore it follows that the effect is produced in an indivisible point of time, and thus moving, being moved, and movement will be instantaneous, the contrary of which has been proved in physics. That an infinite power of a finite magnitude cannot cause movement in time is proved thus. Let A be an infinite power, and A be a part thereof. Therefore, this part will cause movement in more time. And yet there must be proportion between this time and the time in which the whole power causes movement, since both times are finite. Suppose, then, these two times to be in proportion as 1 is to 10, for it does not affect this argument whether we take this or any other ratio. Now, if we increase the aforesaid finite power, we must decrease the time in proportion to the increase of the power, since a greater power causes movement in less time. If, therefore, we increase it tenfold, that power will cause movement in a time which will be 1/10 of the time occupied by the first part that we took of the infinite power, namely AB. And yet this power, which is 10 times the aforesaid power, is a finite power, since it has a fixed proportion to a finite power. It follows, therefore, that a finite power and an infinite power cause movement in an equal time, which is impossible. Therefore, an infinite power of a finite magnitude cannot cause movement in any time. That the power of the first mover is infinite is proved thus. No finite power can cause movement in an infinite time. Now the power of the first mover causes movement in an infinite time, since the first movement is eternal. Therefore, the power of the first mover is infinite. The first proposition is proved thus. If any finite power of a body causes movement in infinite time, a part of that body having a part of that power will cause movement during less time, since a thing will be able to continue a movement for a length of time proportionate to its power, and thus the aforesaid part will cause movement in finite time, and a greater part will be able to cause movement during more time. And so always we increase the time in the same proportion as we increase the power of the mover, but if this increase be made a certain number of times, we shall come to the quantity of the whole, or even go beyond it. Therefore also the increase on the part of the time will reach the quantity of time in which the whole causes movement. And yet the time in which the whole causes movement was supposed to be infinite. Consequently, a finite time will measure an infinite time, which is impossible. However, there are several objections to this chain of reasoning. One of these is that it could be held that the body which moves of things that moves the first thing moved is not divisible, as is in the case of the heavenly body, but the argument given above supposes it to be divided. To this we reply that a conditional clause may be true even if its antecedent is impossible. And if there is anything to disprove such a conditional, the antecedent is impossible. For example, if anyone disproved this conditional, if a man flies, he has wings, the antecedent would be impossible. It is in this way that we are to understand the process of the aforesaid reasoning, for this conditional is true if a heavenly body be divided, its part will have less power than the whole. But this conditional is disproved if we suppose that the first mover is a body on account of the impossibilities that follow. Therefore it is clear that this is impossible. We can reply in the same way if there is an objection to the increase of finite powers. For it is impossible in natural things to find powers according to any proportion that there is between one time and any other time, and yet the conditional required in the aforesaid argument is true. The second objection is that, even if a body is divided, it is possible for a power of a body not to be divided when the body is divided. For example, the rational soul is not divided when the body is divided. To this we reply that by the above argument it is not proved that God is not united to the body as the rational soul is united to the human body, but that he is not a power residing in a body like a material power which is divided when the body is divided. Therefore it is also said of the human intellect that it is neither a body nor a power in a body. See Book 2, Chapter 56. That God is not united to the body as its soul is another question. See Chapter 27. The third objection is that if the power of every body is finite, as is proved in the above process, and if a finite power cannot make its effect to endure an infinite time, it will follow that no body can endure an infinite time, and consequently that a heavenly body will be necessarily corrupted. Some reply to this that a heavenly body in respect of its own power is defectible, but acquires everlastingness from another that has infinite power. Apparently Plato, Timaeus 41, approves of this solution, for he represents God as speaking of the heavenly bodies as follows: by your nature you are corruptible, but by my will incorruptible, because my will is greater than your necessity. But the commentator refutes this solution in Metaphysics, for it is impossible, according to him, that what in itself may possibly not be should acquire everlastingness of being from another, since it would follow that the corruptible is changed into incorruptibility, and this, in his opinion, is impossible. Therefore he relies after this fashion in a heavenly body, whatever power there is, infinite, and yet it does not follow that it has all power, for according to Aristotle in Metaphysics, the potency to be somewhere is in a heavenly body, but not the potency to be, and thus it does not follow that it has a potency to not be. It must be observed, however, that this reply of the commentator is insufficient, because even if it is granted that in a heavenly body there is no quasi-potency to be, which potency is that of matter, there is nevertheless in it a quasi-active potency, which is the power of being, since Aristotle says explicitly in Coli et Mundi that the heaven has the power to be always. Hence it is better to reply that, since power implies relation to act, we should judge of power according to the mode of the act. Now movement by its very nature has quantity and extension, hence its infinite duration requires that the moving power should be infinite. On the other hand, being has no quantitative extension, especially in a thing whose being is invariable, such as the heaven. Hence it does not follow that the power of being a finite body is infinite, though its duration be infinite, because it matters not whether that power make a thing to last for an instant or for an infinite time, since that invariable being is not affected by time except accidentally. The fourth objection is that the statement that what causes movement in infinite time must have an infinite power does not necessarily apply to those movers which are not altered by moving, for such a movement consumes nothing of their power, therefore they can cause movement for no less time after they have moved for a certain time than before. Thus the power of the sun is finite, and because its power is not diminished on account of its action, it can act on this lower world for an infinite time, according to nature. To this we reply that a body does not move unless it is moved, as we have shown. Therefore, supposing a body not to be moved, it follows that it does not move. Now in anything that is moved, there is potency to opposites, since the term of movements are opposites to one another. Consequently, considered in itself, every body that is moved is possibly not moved, and that which is possibly not moved is not able of itself to be moved for an everlasting time, and consequently neither is it apt to move for a perpetual time. Accordingly, the demonstration given above is based on the finite power of a finite body, which power cannot of itself move in an infinite time. But a body which of itself is possibly moved and not moved, and possibly moves and does not move, can acquire perpetual movement from some cause, and this cause must be incorporeal. Thus the first mover must be incorporeal. Hence, according to nature, nothing hinders a finite body which acquires from another cause perpetuity in being moved, from having also perpetuity in moving, for likewise the first heavenly body, according to nature, can cause a perpetual circular movement in the lower bodies, according as one sphere moves another. Now it is impossible for that which is of itself in potency to being moved and not moved to acquire perpetual movement from something else, as the commentator supposed it impossible as regards perpetuity of being, for movement is a kind of outflow from the mover to the thing movable, and consequently a movable thing can acquire perpetual movement from something else without having it by nature. On the other hand, to be is something fixed and resting in a being, and consequently that which is of itself in potency to not be cannot, as he says, in the course of nature acquire from something else perpetuity of being. The fifth objection is that, according to the above reasoning, there does not appear to be more reason why there should not be an infinite power in magnitude than outside a magnitude, for in either case it would follow that it moves in non-time. To this it may be replied that finite and infinite are found in a magnitude, in time, and in movement in a univocal sense, as proved in physics and as proved in Physics Book 3 and Physics Book 6. Hence the infinite in one of them removes a finite proportion in the others, but in things lacking magnitude there is neither finite nor infinite, unless equivocally. Hence the above course of reasoning has no place in such powers. But another and better answer is that the heavens has two movers. One is the proximate mover, which is of finite power, and from this its movement is of a finite velocity. The other is its remote mover, which is of infinite power, from which its movement can be of infinite duration. Thus it is clear that an infinite power, which is not in a magnitude, can move a body not immediately in time, whereas a power which is in magnitude must move immediately, since no body moves without itself being moved. Therefore, if it moved, it would follow that it moves in non-time. Better still, it may be replied that a power which is not in a magnitude is an intellect and moves by its will, hence it moves according to the requirement of the movable and not according to the proportion of its strength. On the other hand, a power that is in a magnitude cannot move save by natural necessity, for it has been proved that the intellect is not a bodily force, therefore it causes movement necessarily according to the proportion of its quantity. Hence it follows that if it moves anything, it moves it instantaneously. In this sense, then, the foregoing objections being refuted, the reasoning of Aristotle follows. Moreover, no movement that proceeds from a bodily mover can be continuous and regular, because a bodily mover in local movement moves by attraction or repulsion, and that which is attracted or repelled is not disposed in the same way towards its mover from the beginning to the end of the movement, since at one time it is nearer to it, and at another time further from it, and thus no body can cause a continuous and regular movement. On the other hand, the first movement is continuous and regular, as is proved in physics. Therefore, the mover of the first movement is not a body. Again, no movement that tends towards an end which passes from potency to act can be perpetual, since when it arrives at act, the movement ceases. If therefore the first movement is perpetual, it must be towards an end, which is always and in every way actual. Now such is neither a body nor a power residing in a body, because these are all movable either essentially or accidentally. Therefore the end of the first movement is not a body nor a power residing in a body. Now the end of the first movement is the first mover, which moves as the object of desire, and that is God. Therefore God is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. Now, though, according to our faith, it is false that the movement of the heavens is everlasting, as we shall show further on, Book 4, Chapter 97. It is nevertheless true that the movement will not cease, either on account of lack of power in the mover, or on account of the substance of the movable being corrupted, since we do not find that the movement of the heavens slackens in the course of time. Hence the aforesaid proofs lose nothing of their efficacy. The truth thus demonstrated concords with divine authority, for it is said, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth, John 4:24. And again, to the King of ages, immortal, invisible, and the only God, 1 Timothy 1:17. And the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, Romans 1:20. For things that are clearly seen not by the eye, but by the mind, are incorporeal. Hereby is refuted the error of the early natural philosophers, who admitted none but material causes, such as fire, water, and the like, and consequently asserted that the first principles of things were bodies, and called them gods. Among these also there were some who held that the cause of movement were friendship and strife, and these again are refuted by the above arguments. For since according to them friendship and strife are in bodies, it would follow that the first principles of movement are forces residing in a body. They also asserted that God was composed of the four elements, and friendship, from which we gather that they held God to be a heavenly body. Among the ancients, Anaxagoras came near to the truth, since he affirmed that all things are moved by an intellect. By this truth, moreover, those heathens are refuted who maintained that the very elements of the world and the forces residing in them are gods, such as the sun, moon, earth, water, and so forth, being led astray by the errors of the philosophers mentioned above. Again, the above arguments confound the nonsense of the unlettered Jews of Tertullian and of Vadiani, or anthropomorphite heretics who depicted God with human features, and again of the Manichaeans who affirmed God to be an infinite substance composed of light and spread abroad throughout boundless space. The occasion of all these errors was that in their thoughts about divine things they had recourse to their imagination, which can reflect none but corporeal likenesses, and thus we must put the imagination aside when we meditate on things incorporeal.